It was March 1943. The wind ripped across the runway at Wright Field Air Force Base in Ohio, while the morning sun struggled to pierce the cold fog. The smell of jet fuel mingled with the humid air. In the distance, the metallic clang of tools echoed through the hangars. Radial engines tested their revs. The war was consuming resources like never before in American history. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from right now? Comment below with the name of your city or country. It's always impressive to see how far these stories reach around the world. Now, let's go back to that day, where it all began. Inside Hangar Number 7, engineers silently observed a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighter. The aircraft weighed over 4.5 tons fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower. It was a formidable machine. But there was a problem plaguing the United States Army Air Materiel Command. Fuel consumption was destroying its operational range. The numbers were unyielding. In combat, flying at maximum continuous power, the Thunderbolt consumed its 370-liter internal fuel tank in less than 2 hours. This meant limited range, reduced time over target, and escort missions that ended before protecting the bombers to their targets in occupied Europe. The United States Army Air Force was losing aircraft not due to combat failure, but due to logistical limitations. Charles Lindbergh was 41 years old when he arrived at the base. His name already carried the weight of history. 16 years earlier, he had crossed the Atlantic solo, flying for 33.5 hours non-stop. But that flight wasn't just courage, it was calculation. Lindbergh was an engineer before he was a pilot. He understood engines, aerodynamics, fuel consumption, and operational limits with the coolness of someone who deals with numbers, not emotions. Now in wartime he wasn't in uniform. Technically he was a civilian consultant, but his experience in long-range flights had caught the attention of high command. The question they asked him was straightforward. Is it possible to make these fighters fly further without adding larger external tanks or redesigning the structure? Lindbergh spent days studying technical manuals. He reviewed engine performance tables. He analyzed fuel consumption curves at different engine speeds and intake pressures. The answer was in the data, but it completely contradicted prevailing doctrine. Pilots were trained to fly at high power. The idea was to maintain safety, responsiveness, and immediate maneuverability in the event of enemy contact. Reducing power was seen as an unacceptable risk, but Lindbergh saw something different. He noticed that radial engines operated in bands of variable efficiency. At high RPM, they consumed fuel disproportionately to the speed they gained. There was a zone between 1,600 and 1,800 RPM with low manifold pressure, where the engine still produced enough thrust for cruise flight, but consumed almost half the fuel. It was basic physics. It was applied thermodynamics. But no one in the operational Air Force was testing this in combat. The problem wasn't technical. It was cultural. Fighter pilots were trained to trust the roar of the engine. The loud sound meant available power. Reducing power seemed weak, hesitant, vulnerable. Lindbergh knew he would have to prove in practice that mathematical logic trumped emotional intuition. He proposed a test. He would fly the Thunderbolt under the new power settings, measuring consumption, speed, stability, and response time. If it worked, it would be possible to rewrite the operating procedures for the entire U.S. Army fighter fleet. If it failed, the risk would be his alone. The next morning, the sky was clear over Ohio. Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit of the P-47. The engine fired. The four-blade propeller began to slice through the air. He adjusted the fuel mixture, checked the instruments, and released the brakes. Takeoff was standard, but upon reaching cruising altitude, he did something no fighter pilot would do on a mission. He reduced the engine speed to 1,600 RPM and adjusted the manifold pressure to just 23 inches of mercury. The roar subsided. The panel vibrated less. The aircraft continued flying, stable, controllable, efficient. Lindbergh looked at the fuel flow indicator. The numbers confirmed his theory. Consumption had dropped dramatically. He flew for more than 4 hours straight. When he landed, there was still fuel in the tank. The test was repeated, and repeated again, always with the same results. The discovery was simple, but its implications were enormous. The news spread through the corridors of Air Materiel Command. Like a technical rumor, no one wanted to fully believe. Lindbergh had just proven it was possible to fly a heavy fighter for over 4 hours, continuously using only 2/3 of normal power. The engineers reviewed the data 3 times. The numbers didn't lie. Fuel consumption had dropped from approximately 240 liters per hour to about 130 liters per hour. Range had practically doubled without adding a single extra liter to the tanks. But there was resistance. Not among engineers, but among operational pilots. The combat mentality was clear. High power meant safety. In an encounter with enemy fighters, every horsepower could mean the difference between escape and being shot down. Reducing engine speed seemed too risky a gamble. The argument was valid. No one wanted to teach pilots to fly slowly, while the Third Reich dominated the skies over Europe with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Lindbergh knew he had to go beyond controlled testing. He needed to prove the technique under real combat conditions. And the opportunity arose unexpectedly. In April 1944, he received authorization to travel to the Pacific Theater of Operations as a technical consultant. Officially, his mission was to observe the fighters' performance in tropical climates. But Lindbergh had another objective: to fly combat missions and apply his fuel-saving techniques under live fire. The 5th Air Force operated from bases in New Guinea. The heat was stifling. Humidity corroded metal and fabric. Lockheed P-38 Lightning and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters faced not only the Japanese, but also the brutal logistics of the Pacific. Every liter of fuel had to be transported thousands of miles through dangerous sea routes. Extending the fighters' range meant fewer aborted missions, more cover for the bombers, and greater pressure on enemy positions. Lindbergh arrived at Nadzab base in May. He was a civilian, but the pilots knew him by name. There was respect, but also skepticism. He requested permission to fly combat patrols. The request was granted with conditions. He could not take unnecessary risks and had to follow the orders of the squadron leader. Lindbergh agreed, but in his flight logbook, he noted parameters that differed from the standard manuals. On his first mission, he flew a P-38 Lightning. The aircraft had 2 1710 Allison V engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower. Standard cruise fuel consumption was high. Lindbergh adjusted the RPM to 1,600 RPM and reduced manifold pressure to levels that would make any instructor question his sanity. The Lightning continued flying. The formation held its position. No one noticed a difference in performance. Upon returning, Lindbergh calculated his remaining fuel. He had flown the same mission as the other pilots, but still had enough fuel for another hour of flight. His flightmates checked the tanks. Some thought he had flown less time. Others thought the gauges were wrong. But Lindbergh just smiled and showed the numbers written on his knee. RPM, pressure, fuel consumption, time, everything documented. He repeated the procedure on subsequent missions, always with the same results. The pilots began to pay attention. Some tried to imitate his setup. It worked. Soon entire squadrons were flying farther, patrolling for longer, and returning with fuel reserves that had previously seemed impossible. But the technique required discipline. It wasn't just about reducing power. It was about understanding the engine. Lindbergh taught that it was necessary to adjust the fuel mixture, control cylinder temperature, monitor oil pressure, and fly with constant precision. The engine could not be forced or neglected. It was a delicate balance between efficiency and availability. Pilots who tried to reduce power without adjusting the mixture ended up with overheated engines or a real loss of performance. Lindbergh spent weeks flying with different units. He recorded everything: ambient temperature, altitude, weapons load, total aircraft weight. Every variable was tested. He discovered that the technique worked best at medium altitudes, between 3,000 and 6,000 meters, where the air density allowed efficient combustion without requiring excessive enrichment of the mixture. At low altitudes, the technique still worked, but with smaller margins. At high altitudes above 7,000 meters, efficiency decreased due to the need for continuous supercharging of the engines. Reports began to trickle up the chain of command. Senior officers read them with interest. Some dismissed the findings as anomalies, others requested more data, but the numbers kept coming. Squadrons that adopted Lindbergh's techniques were flying up to 50% farther with the same fuel load. Missions that had previously ended midway were now achieving their objectives. The difference was strategic. In June, Lindbergh flew an escort mission to Biak Island. The distance was over 600 kilometers round trip. Most pilots considered it the operational limit, But Lindbergh flew with his settings. He arrived at the target, patrolled for 40 minutes and returned with fuel remaining. When he landed, there were witnesses. Officers measured the remaining fuel. It was real. There was no trickery. From that moment on, the technique ceased to be experimental and became operational doctrine. The impact of Lindbergh's discovery began to spread beyond the Pacific Theater. In July 1944, copies of his reports reached air bases in England, where the United States 8th Air Force was waging a strategic bombing campaign over Germany. There, the problem of range was even more critical. P-51 Mustang fighters had to escort Boeing B-17 and consolidated B-24 heavy bombers on missions that penetrated enemy territory by more than 1,600 kilometers. Every additional minute in the air meant extra protection from Luftwaffe interceptors. Group commanders began studying the techniques. There was initial skepticism. The war in Europe was different. German pilots were experienced, aggressive, and flew in coordinated formations. The idea of reducing engine power during escort flights seemed contradictory, but the numbers were too convincing to ignore. Tests were authorized under controlled conditions, far from combat routes. Captain Robert Johnson was 23 years old and already one of the most respected pilots in the 5th and 6th Fighter Groups. He had shot down 27 enemy aircraft and survived situations where others would have been lost. Johnson wasn't reckless, he was calculating. When he read Lindbergh's report, he recognized its logic. He knew that war wasn't just about courage, it was about mathematics, physics, and resource management. Johnson decided to test the settings during a training mission over the English Channel. He flew his P-51 at 1,600 RPM, setting the manifold pressure to 26 inches of mercury. The aircraft responded normally. Speed dropped only 15 miles per hour from standard cruise, but fuel consumption plummeted. When he landed, he did some quick math. With that setup, he could fly to Berlin and back without extra large tanks. It was revolutionary. He shared the results with other pilots. The reaction was mixed. Some saw potential. Others thought it too risky. The argument was always the same. What if they encountered enemies during cruise? Reducing power meant losing precious seconds to accelerate again. Johnson countered with data. He timed the time it took to return to combat power, less than 5 seconds. In an aerial dogfight, 5 seconds could be critical, but in cruise, with adequate surveillance and disciplined formation, the likelihood of ambush was low, and the increased range outweighed the risk. In August, 8th Air Force Command issued a technical directive recommending the use of economy cruise configurations on escort flights. It wasn't mandatory, it was suggested. Experienced pilots like Johnson began adopting the technique on real missions. The results were immediate. Missions that previously required 2 external auxiliary tanks of 470 liters each could now be flown with smaller tanks, or even just 1 extra tank. This freed up wing mounting points for additional weapons, or allowed for greater tactical flexibility. But the technique wasn't universal. Not all pilots were able to apply it correctly. Some tried to cut power without adjusting the fuel mixture. The result was engine overheating or a real loss of performance. Others struggled to maintain discipline during long missions. The temptation to increase power for psychological safety was strong. Lindbergh had identified this in his reports. The technique required not only technical knowledge, but also emotional control. The pilot had to rely on numbers, not feelings. To address this, specific training sessions were organized. Instructors explained the physics of radial and inline engines. They showed graphs of fuel consumption versus power. They taught how to monitor cylinder temperature, oil pressure, and mixture enrichment. The training lasted 3 days. At the end, pilots flew simulated missions applying the settings under supervision. Those who mastered the technique received authorization to use it in combat. In September, an event definitively proved the technique's value. A group of 16 P-51 Mustangs escorted a bomber formation to Stuttgart, Germany. The total mission distance was approximately 1,400 kilometers. The pilots flew in economy configuration during the outbound cruise. Upon reaching the target area, they switched to combat power. They faced Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 interceptors. The combat lasted 12 minutes. 3 enemy aircraft were shot down. No Mustangs were lost. Upon return, the pilots reverted to economy. The difference was felt immediately. While groups flying at standard power began reporting low fuel and had to return directly to base, Johnson's group still had autonomy. They were able to divert to avoid an area of heavy anti-aircraft activity and even escort a damaged bomber that had separated from the main formation. Upon landing in England, the tank still had reserves. The mission report was sent to command. The conclusion was clear. The economic cruise technique not only worked but could change the way aerial warfare was fought. It wasn't just about flying further. It was about having more tactical options, greater operational flexibility, and a better survivability rate. In October, the technique was officially incorporated into the 8th and 9th Air Force's operating manuals. All fighter pilots received mandatory training. Resistance still existed, but the data was undeniable. Squadrons that adopted the technique had higher mission completion rates and a lower incidence of emergency landings due to lack of fuel. Lindbergh continued to fly in the Pacific, but now his reports were read in Washington, London, and at forward bases in the Mediterranean. He had done something rare in wartime: change operational doctrine not through orders from above, but through irrefutable practical evidence. In November 1944, the war entered its most brutal phase. Allied forces advanced through France toward the German border. In the Pacific, islands were being captured one by one in grueling battles. Fuel logistics remained one of the greatest operational challenges. Every gallon saved in the air meant one less gallon that needed to be transported across dangerous oceans or destroyed roads. Lindbergh's technique wasn't just about efficiency, it was about strategic survival. Charles Lindbergh had returned to the United States in August, but his legacy continued to expand. Pilots who never met him personally flew using his principles. The technique earned nicknames at the bases. Some called it the Lindbergh flight, others called it the long cruise, but the official name in the technical manuals was more straightforward: economic cruise configuration. The description was precise: 1,600 to 1,800 revolutions per minute, manifold pressure between 23 and 28 inches of mercury, and the mixture adjusted for maximum thermal efficiency. But the application of the technique revealed something deeper. It exposed a flaw in the way pilots were trained. For years, the emphasis was on combat maneuvers, shooting, formation, and survival under fire. Little time was devoted to truly understanding the engines. Pilots knew how to operate the controls, but they didn't understand the physics behind them. Lindbergh's technique required knowledge, and knowledge required education. Training schools began revising their curricula. Classes on engine thermodynamics were added. Instructors taught how RPM affected volumetric efficiency, how manifold pressure influenced combustion temperature, and how the air-fuel mixture determined engine longevity. New pilots emerged from training not only knowing how to fly, but also understanding why the aircraft flew the way it did. Lieutenant James Howard was 28 years old and commanded a squadron of P-51 Mustangs based in East Anglia, England. He had studied engineering before the war and had always been interested in mechanical efficiency. When he read about Lindbergh's technique, he saw not only fuel economy, but also a different operational philosophy. Howard began training his squadron methodically. Each pilot had to demonstrate precise control over engine parameters before flying combat missions. The results came in December. During an escort mission to Munich, Howard's squadron encountered adverse weather conditions. Headwinds reduced ground speed. Other units had to abort due to excessive fuel consumption, but Howard's squadron continued. They had begun the mission in economy configuration and had sufficient margin to withstand the winds. They reached the target, completed the escort mission, and returned without losses. The report caught the attention of 8th Air Force Fighter Command. Howard was summoned to explain how his squadron had managed to complete a mission others considered impossible. He presented the flight data and demonstrated that the economical configuration was not just an emergency technique, but should be the operational standard. The response from senior officers was cautious. There was concern that the emphasis on economy would compromise aggressiveness in combat. Howard argued that aggressiveness without fuel was futile. Logic prevailed. In January 1945, a new directive was issued. All escort flights were to begin in an economy configuration. Switching to combat power would only be done in 3 situations: visual contact with enemies, entry into a confirmed combat zone, or direct order from the formation leader. Outside of these situations, pilots were to maintain a reduced rotation and adjusted mixture. The change was as much cultural as technical, but not everyone accepted it easily. Veteran pilots, especially those with many aerial victories, felt that the technique limited their ability to react. The argument was emotional, not rational. They had survived flying one way. Change seemed unnecessary. Some squadron commanders allowed flexibility. Others were rigid. Tension existed, but the numbers continued to favor the technique. In the Pacific, the story was different. There, the distances were so great that the technique wasn't optional. It was an absolute necessity. Strike missions over the Philippines, Taiwan, and later mainland Japan demanded every drop of available fuel. Pilots who didn't master the technique simply couldn't complete the missions. Operational natural selection worked quickly. Within a few months, virtually all fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater were flying in an economy configuration as standard. Major Thomas Maguire was one of the 5th Air Force's most aggressive aces. He had shot down 38 enemy aircraft and had a reputation as a daring pilot. But Maguire was also intelligent. He understood that endurance meant more time over enemy territory, which meant more combat opportunities. He adopted Lindbergh's technique not to fly defensively, but to increase his chances of finding targets. On a mission over Luzon Island, Maguire led 4 P-38 Lightnings on a free fighter patrol. They flew in economy configuration to the area of operations. Upon spotting an enemy formation, they switched to combat power. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. Maguire shot down 3 aircraft. After the engagement, he returned to economy configuration and continued patrolling. 2 hours later, he encountered another formation and shot down another aircraft. He only returned to base when his fuel reserves reached their minimum. No other pilot in that region had managed to stay so long over enemy territory in a single mission. Maguire's report circulated among the squadrons. The message was clear. Technology didn't limit combat. It enhanced it. Aggressive pilots could be even more effective if they understood how to manage their resources. War wasn't just about courage. It was about intelligence applied under pressure. In February, the United States Army Air Command published a technical manual consolidating all the findings on economic cruise configuration. The document was 142 pages long. It included fuel consumption tables for all engine types in use, thermal efficiency charts, mixture adjustment procedures, and quick change protocols for combat power. The manual was distributed to all fighter units in all theaters of operation. The technique that began as a civilian experiment had become official doctrine of the American Air Force. The spring of 1945 brought profound changes to the war. In Europe, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany. In the Pacific, the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were captured in fierce fighting. Air superiority was no longer in question, but the technique of economic configuration continued to prove its worth, not only in combat, but also in the logistics that supported operations. The accumulated figures since the technique's adoption were impressive. Estimates from the Air Materiel Command indicated savings of over 30% in total aviation fuel consumption for fighter units. In practical terms, this translated to millions of liters saved monthly, fuel that didn't need to be refined, transported, stored, and distributed. The savings allowed resources to be redirected to other critical areas of military logistics. But the most significant impact wasn't in the numbers. It was in the missions that were previously impossible that now became feasible. Fighters could escort bombers to targets deep in Germany and return with a safe margin. Patrols over the Pacific could cover larger areas for longer periods. Damaged aircraft had a better chance of reaching friendly bases before running out of fuel. The technology didn't just change efficiency, it changed tactical possibilities. Captain Charles Older flew P-51 Mustangs based at Iwo Jima. He participated in escort missions for Boeing B-29 Superfortresses attacking mainland Japan. The distances were extreme, over 1,200 miles each way to Tokyo. Winds at altitude could add or subtract flight hours. Older had completely mastered the economic technique. He knew how to adjust the mixture not only for altitude, but also for wind and temperature conditions. His ability to read the instruments and anticipate engine behavior was almost instinctive. In March, during a mission over Tokyo Bay, the bomber formation was attacked by Japanese interceptors. The fight lasted 23 minutes. Older and his squadron faced Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate fighters. The fight was intense. After the fight, several pilots reported low fuel. But Older had started the mission in economy mode and managed each phase of the flight with mathematical precision. He still had enough range not only to return, but also to escort two damaged bombers that had separated from the main formation. The two B-29s were flying low with damaged engines and reduced speed. Older adjusted his formation to protect them. He knew any Japanese interceptors would see those bombers as easy targets. The return journey took 4 hours and 15 minutes. Older remained in position the entire way. When he finally sighted Iwo Jima, the bombers landed first. Older then landed with less than 50 liters of fuel in the tanks. The margin was slim, but sufficient. The two bombers were saved. 22 men returned alive. Older's report reached command with special attention. Without the economical technique, that mission would have ended differently. He wouldn't have had the fuel to stay with the bombers. He would have been forced to return earlier. The two B-29s, alone and vulnerable, would likely have been shot down or forced to ditch at sea. The technique wasn't just about efficiency, it was about survival. In April, with Germany's surrender looming, the 8th Air Force began preparing units for transfer to the Pacific. The expectation was an invasion of mainland Japan. Experienced pilots from Europe would be essential, but the transition required adaptation. The distances in the Pacific were greater. Logistics were more complex. Economical techniques, which in Europe were a tactical advantage, in the Pacific would be a matter of absolute survival. Intensive training was organized. Pilots who had flown over Germany now learned about Pacific winds, high-altitude currents, open ocean navigation, and fuel management on missions lasting more than 6 hours. Lindbergh's technique was the foundation of everything. Without it, the planned operations would have been impossible, but the war ended before an invasion was necessary. In August, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. World War II ended. Fighter jets no longer needed to fly combat missions, but the technique Lindbergh developed did not disappear with peace. In the following months, as the American military demobilized, engineers began reviewing everything they had learned during the war. The economic configuration technique was studied in detail. Reports were compiled. Data from thousands of missions were analyzed. The conclusion was unanimous. The technique represented a significant advance in operational aviation. These principles were incorporated into the development of new aircraft. Engines began to be designed with efficiency ranges optimized for extended cruising. Fuel flow measurement instruments were improved. Pilot training began to include energy management as a fundamental discipline. What began as a one-man experiment became the foundation for all modern military aviation. Charles Lindbergh never sought public recognition for his work. He had done what he thought was necessary. He flew the missions. He recorded the data. He shared his discoveries. To him, it was simply the application of physics and logic to a real problem. There was no heroism in it, just method. But the pilots who flew using his techniques knew the value of what he had done. Every mission accomplished, every aircraft that returned with sufficient fuel, every life saved because of the extra range, all were a direct result of that quiet work. The war was won for many reasons. This was one of them. And when history was written, it was recorded not only in fuel consumption statistics, but in the memories of those who flew. They knew someone had thought beyond the obvious, had questioned doctrine, had proven there was a better way, and in doing so, had changed warfare. The years following the end of World War II brought profound transformations in aviation. The age of jet engines was dawning. Aircraft were becoming faster, more complex, and more capable. But the principles discovered by Charles Lindbergh during those flights over the Pacific and refined by thousands of combat pilots did not become obsolete. On the contrary, they became even more relevant. In 1946, the United States Strategic Air Command was created to operate long-range bombers. The mission required extreme range. Aircraft like the Convair B-36 Peacemaker were designed to fly intercontinental missions without refueling. But even with massive tanks, efficiency remained critical. Engineers revisited wartime data. They studied economical cruising techniques. They applied the same principles to the development of new engines and flight profiles. Commercial aviation also benefited. Airlines beginning to operate transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes faced the same problem the military had faced: how to fly farther with less fuel. Data compiled during the war was shared with civilian industry. Commercial pilots began to be trained in efficient cruising techniques. The economic impact was immense. Every percentage of fuel saved translated into millions of dollars. in reduced operating costs. But beyond economy and efficiency, Lindbergh's technique revealed something deeper. It showed that intuition wasn't always enough. That experience without technical understanding had its limits, that the way something had always been done wasn't necessarily the best way. This lesson transcended aviation. It became a principle applicable to any complex system where efficiency mattered. In the decades that followed, as aviation evolved, the principles remained. During the Korean War, Republic F-84 Thunderjet pilots used fuel-efficient configurations on ground attack missions. In the Vietnam War, fighters like the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom were flown in range-optimized profiles when escorting bombers or conducting combat air patrols. The technique had become so second nature that few pilots knew its origins. It was simply the right way to fly. Charles Lindbergh lived until 1974. He never spoke publicly about his contribution to operational efficiency during the war. There were other aspects of his life that attracted attention: the transatlantic flight of 1927, the political controversies before the war, the personal tragedy of his son's kidnapping. But among those who knew the full story, there was quiet respect for the technical work he had done when the nation needed it. The official records were there. Technical reports archived at the National Air and Space Museum, operating manuals stored in military libraries, flight logs of pilots who had applied the techniques. The story wasn't lost. It was just quiet, as Lindbergh preferred. In 2003, the United States Air Force published a landmark study on the evolution of operational tactics. An entire chapter was devoted to the development of economic cruising techniques during World War II. The study formally recognized the contributions of Lindbergh and the pilots who had refined and proven the techniques in combat. The document circulated among military academies and aviation schools. A new generation of pilots learned the story. Today, any military or commercial pilot flying long-range aircraft applies principles derived from that work. Computerized flight management systems automatically calculate the optimal engine settings for each phase of the mission. But the logic behind the algorithms is the same one Lindbergh noted in his flight notebook over New Guinea in 1944. Finding the point where efficiency and performance balance, flying not at maximum power, but at optimum power. The lesson went beyond aviation. Systems engineers learned that optimization doesn't always mean using maximum capacity. Sometimes it means finding the operating regime where the system delivers the required result with the least expenditure of resources. This philosophy influenced the design of automotive engines, industrial turbines, and naval propulsion systems. The principle was universal. Efficiency wasn't weakness, it was intelligence. And there was something else that history revealed. It showed that doctrinal change doesn't have to come from the top down. It can come from careful observation, methodical testing, and irrefutable evidence. Lindbergh had no command authority. He was a civilian, but he had data. And data, when honest and replicable, carried more weight than hierarchy. The pilots who flew those missions during the war never forgot. Some wrote memoirs, others gave interviews decades later. They always spoke of the moment they learned the technique, how wrong it seemed at first, how the instructors insisted they try it, how it worked on the first mission, how it changed the way they thought about flying. There was gratitude in those accounts, not just for the efficiency or the extra autonomy, but for having learned something fundamental. That war wasn't just about bravery, it was also about thinking. That survival didn't just depend on reflexes, it depended on understanding that the difference between getting home or not could be something as simple as correctly adjusting an engine's RPM. World War II produced countless technological innovations: radar, computers, nuclear weapons, jets, antibiotics. But not every innovation was new technology. Sometimes it was simply a smarter use of existing technology. The economic cruising technique was just that. It didn't require new engines, it didn't require new fuels. It simply required a different understanding of how to use what was already available. And perhaps this is the most enduring lesson, that before seeking complex solutions, it's worth reviewing whether we're using what we already have effectively. That efficiency begins with knowledge, that small adjustments, applied consistently, produce enormous results over time. The fighters from that war are now in museums. The pilots who flew them are either gone or in their final years. But the principles they discovered live on, in every commercial flight that crosses oceans, in every long-range military mission, in every system that was optimized not by adding more capacity, but by better utilizing existing capacity. Charles Lindbergh cut the power to the engines not out of fear, but out of understanding. And in doing so, he showed that intelligence can be as powerful as horsepower. That knowledge can save more lives than courage. That sometimes the bravest thing to do is to question what everyone accepts as truth. The history